we go on with the context. So, Maria Paz, you have the floor. Well, I want to welcome you all to this session. In this block, we are going to analyze the challenges posed by the pandemic from the point of view of production and delivery of data by governments, but also other players in society that have had and continue to have a key role in the use of technology, and also play a key role in transmitting information through it.
So we have this afternoon with us 3 speakers that are essential. We have Edison Lanza, who is speaker for human rights and of the Organization of American States. We also have Maria José Calderón, who's executive director of the Democracy Institute, an agency that has to do with elections in Ecuador, as well as Maryleana Mendez, who is executive secretary of ASIET, the telecommunications operators organization of our region, and represents the experience of this Inter-American Association in the field of telecommunications and also in the context of this pandemic. So we're going to listen to 3 different standpoints on this topic that we have proposed. And we'll then start with Edison Lanza, who's speaking about the challenges of transparency and delivering information in the context of the pandemic and how this has an impact in the rights of all inhabitants in the region. Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Maria Paz, for your information to participate in the Internet Governance Forum in the chapter of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is an honor for me. I couldn't attend during the last meeting, and this will be my last opportunity to speak in my role. So I'll be sharing with you some of the ideas that we have developed on this topic in recent times. As you were saying, this pandemic put us before an emergency situation with risks for the health of the population and also for the functioning of the democratic societies. And this, of course, for reasons that we are all aware of. As a result, the states reacted in given ways. Legitimately, they had the duty to adopt measures in order to face the pandemic and to reduce the circulation of people, to respond to the hotspots, and also to prepare the health infrastructure as well as other aspects. But in an initial resolution issued by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we recognized that under given circumstances, several governments of the region adopted measures that to a certain extent were considered disproportionate or not sufficiently justified in order to respond to their responsibilities in the context of public health. This imposed restrictions to the freedom of expression, to the freedom of press. There is the right to access public information, and also a given period of time to respond to requests, reduction of the active transparency, and restrictive measures for providing public information. And obviously, of course, for the purpose of privacy. There were technological tools already available, but the use of these tools became like a catalyzer, like a trigger to, for example, monitor the population, the circulation of the population, and to do cyber patrolling. In many countries, this even led to the criminalization of an expression of things that the governments considered were against their interests, or criticism to the response the government was giving, or that even encouraged to disobey the regulations. So it is in that context that we also, and I will now resume where I started. Over the past months, we worked on the impact of the use of technologies on human rights. I think there are 4 important categories. I think all human rights were affected by this pandemic, but there are 4 main topics related to what we are discussing today. One has to do with the capacity or the compliance of all people with the right to information, the right to be connected. For example, this has to do with the digital divide and the reduction of the digital divide, which becomes a very urgent need in the context of a pandemic, where the main measure was stay at home, don't run the risk, work from home, access communications and information and entertainment from home. We have recently issued a very complete document and going to produce a guideline with recommendations, because we have many lessons learned. 4 or 5 years ago, or even more, ever since the governments have the obligation of putting an end to the digital divide, which makes those who are vulnerable even more vulnerable, and which affects people who might suffer from discrimination, or there's a differentiated access to technologies and these things. And then there was an infodemia. There was a lack of information on the pandemic. We now strongly saw that there's a lack of information on the pandemic, lack of information on the pharmaceutical methods, as well as mistrust with respect to science, which obviously plays a very important role. Nevertheless, there were interested parties, also for religious reason, and other people who, for several reasons, bombarded misinformation on the pandemic or on science. And fourthly, monitoring and tracing and people who were infected. And to close, let me focus on this last point, because I think this is strongly linked to what was stated in the previous panel, which are the standards that the states have to respect so that these tools do not represent a disproportionate interference with the privacy of people and prevents them from practicing their rights, or exposes the privacy of people in a way that might be disproportionate.
So let me see, do you see it? So here you are. About a month ago, we issued a directive on human rights and pandemic, and one of the chapters, especially on access to healthcare, and access to informed consent for therapies that are a bit the core of the rights that may be at risk, but also the resolution that is approved by the Inter-American Committee includes guidelines for the protection of personal data of the people with COVID-19. But this is the first thing that we have about the confidentiality, privacy, and technology. And I think that this may turn into precedent for the future. The idea is to add this issue of data protection, and so that in the future it will be considered a part of the mandate for the Commission. We acknowledge that geolocation and warnings for COVID exposure that were developed by private companies and even governments should be controlled. The public or private agents that gather this information should also request the people's consent to include that information to the big data, and they should report the aim and how the information will be used and shared. And second, to conduct a previous assessment and a public assessment of the impact of these technologies that have an impact on the people, and especially the georeference information, to justify the benefits of that tool. Because we saw the risk of having a proliferation of apps without really knowing whether they're of any use. And we are dealing with fundamental rights. So we have to explain people that we are going to have a minimum impact on privacy, but that is for the sake of a clear, greater benefit, and not because it's a technological experiment to see how it works, but then we don't know what happens with the data produced. And also to prevent the targeted selection of the people and identification of the people, and to make sure that these apps are used solely for that purpose. The storage of the personal data need to be limited to the time absolutely necessary, and relating it to the identity. Today you showed good examples showing those geographic spots that don't identify people. I remember that in Chile there was they identified the households, and also to respect the privacy of people and make sure that the personal data are used only for this purpose. And then if they're using an artificial intelligence means if they are going to use these algorithms, they need to make sure that they don't have an impact on human rights, and the governments shouldn't use the data gathered through artificial intelligence to issue, for instance, immunization certificates, or to generate different treatment between people that are infected or not, but that may be used only for the benefit of the people. So I think that this is a very good opportunity. This event is very good to disseminate these standards that are recommendations that the governments should comply with, and because they are part of human rights. And also we believe that it's legitimate for civil society to claim about the lack of standards for these issues. Thank you, Edison. There's no doubt that civil society received this statement by the Human Rights Commission at the beginning of this pandemic was very timely. And it's been inspiring for the civil society. Now we are going to give the floor to María José Calderón from Ecuador, who is going to share a different angle with a topic that is absolutely relevant in this pandemic. And it has to do with how during the pandemic we continue to see there must be elections, and that the governments need to continue with an activity as normal as possible. In all the countries, the elections are relevant, but specifically in a situation where we had many social discomfort, riots, and social unrest. So it is especially important to consider how the pandemic, what impact it has on the elections processes. She's going to tell us about Ecuador. We have an experience that may be useful and can be considered by the countries in the region that are facing elections while in the pandemic. So, Maria Jose, you have the floor. Thank you. It's an honor for me to share this with you. My greetings from the Institute of Democracy in Quito. And what I'd love to share with you, and I'd love to request Edison to please let me share my presentation. It's to give you an account of what the electoral authorities have faced these months in preparation for our elections in a country like ours where voting is mandatory. So if people don't go to vote, they are fined, and this cannot be changed. So in the midst of a pandemic, this implied very significant risks. So we realized that for good or for bad, the norm didn't solve the problem. So in the political organizations, we saw that problem, but especially the problem is during when with the ballot and the possibility of changing the systems. Constitutionally, we have the possibility of telematic voting, of mailing. So and the, in but this is important for the trust that people that people have about the results of the voting. So just to give you the context, we face some challenges. We all know we started with the pandemic here on March 11th. This was the first global pandemic, humanitarian pandemic. In Ecuador, we had quite a sui generis and situation. In Guayaquil, for instance, they had the first problems, and basically they and they coordinated the data with what was happening, and we started with a significant outbreak. This and we had many criticisms, and the problem was that we were having many more infections than the official figures were giving. So the elections, many electoral processes were suspended, for instance, in France, and also in the United States. They didn't suspend it, but they tried to activate other forms for voting. And the question is, to what extent this pandemic is causing distrust among people with the institutions. We have a long list of countries where the decisions about the elections were either postponed or suspended. The economic factor is essential. We are living one of the worst crisis in the century. The mandatory electoral process is very expensive. It's complex from the logistic standpoint, and it implies adding all the biosafety protocols to be implemented to ensure that we reduce contagion to a minimum. So we have to preserve the people's health and to sustain the democratic system, providing the conditions that reliable. We are now Well, elections are always a mix of hope or redemption, but at the same time, we are afraid. That is what happened with the population. So people experience the electoral process in many different ways. So the electoral regulations maintain their are maintained because you can't change the rules of the game the year of the elections. And the law was amended precisely in late February 2020. So we couldn't change some of the regulations that were established, but they we could adapt some alternatives. One of them was blockchain. This was suggested for the largest electoral counties in Quito and Guayaquil, for instance. You know how the system, blockchain system works, and why was it important to raise it to a category of a policy? We have to somehow rely on the electoral authorities, but also to trust each other as political parties. We have to trust the political system and the citizens.
And the citizens who can make decisions without any risk and without any fear. And this is typical for Latin America in the sense that we don't trust the electoral processes. So this proposal was discussed and debated among the political stakeholders and so on. And it was finally decided that for some reasons, maybe the risk or the amount of investment for maintaining a system such as this could make this somewhat complex. So it was decided to maintain the elections as they always were, maybe including the number of voting places to decrease the risk. And, you know, people who are receiving people who vote have to be there for 8 hours or longer. So there are some regulations that are being discussed, and this also involves a decision that will depend on the financial authority that has to respond to all these needs. Here we have an example of successful cases. We discussed this with other academic agencies similar to ours throughout Latin America. And this is a debate regarding trust. And this really was one of the concerns we have. For example, I don't trust anything that has some kind of mediation, and even less in politics, because really have to look at my contender in the face, my constituents. They really have to perceive that I can ensure the votes they are casting. So this led to a series of very strong complications, for example, when determining the internal democratic processes. More than ever, although this might seem an administrative process, we won't accept any candidates who have not followed an internal democratic process. Now, for the first time, the internal democratic process was carried out through Zoom, and other interactions took place through WhatsApp or through Signal if they wanted to have partnerships that should take place in the background. Now, this showed that basically we have a very serious problem, particularly in the level of education. We are also involved in those issues, for example, promoting optional voting from ages 16 to 18. But the elections authorities have to promote elections at schools and civil education. We saw that more than 1 million people didn't even have computers or access to the internet. So being so suffering from the digital divide, affected a large segment of the population. So transferring the academic system, for example, teleworking and tele-education, was done a lot through WhatsApp. WhatsApp and mobile phones. For example, the students had to recharge their mobile phones, and it was it's something that's very expensive in Ecuador, but it was the only way they could access some kind of basic education. This slide shows data from last year. These are the indicators of access, people who use the internet. We see that there is quite a strong reduction. These are the apps that were downloaded most in July 2020. Zoom, WhatsApp, of course, for Android and for iOS. Because we tried in whichever way to reach out to the largest percentage of the population possible, not only with the elections message, but also to obtain legitimacy in any kind of political process. The education system, and although it is quite true that from age 16 to 18 voting is optional, the education system also focuses on the importance of voting. For the first time, migration to a mobile device was required, and we had to generate trust among the constituents and citizens. Let me share an example with you, an example that has to do with the primary elections, and this is something that concluded in Ecuador just a few days ago. Primary elections have to be done in an assembly. So the assembly was transferred to other digital areas. Which were the major risks? Most of the traditional parties that date back many years, where the leaders are more elderly people, understood that this was an obstacle compared to the traditional ways of doing campaigns. And this previous system was face-to-face. And not being face-to-face and having to speak horizontally in a screen that was through Zoom, many of these leaders had to change their discourse and use a different way of conducting politics to reflect on what they're doing well and what they're not doing well. Why are young people not so interested in participating in politics? So this is one of the things we detected. And then also banning any kind of meetings. This was forbidden in my country. There are limitations to have a maximum of 20 people for groups. Major events, numerous events are forbidden. And accepting a candidate normally, and this hasn't changed ever since we're a republic, is something that is done personally. For example, in the former elections tribunal, these things are done more formally. Apparently, the pandemic has also affected these situations. So something happened, namely that the former president, Rafael Correa, wished to register as a vice president virtually through an iPad. His sister, who's the one who's signing, when they went to register his nomination, took the iPad in her hand. So, you know, we always have to be careful. We have to maintain social distancing and so on. Now, people should not participate in meetings. Now, ultimately, this was not accepted because this is an administrative process, but it is like a checklist. So if this party doesn't take into account all these things, where the charismatic leaders had to show their charisma through a screen, these things changed radically the way of conducting politics. That picture was yesterday, it was taken yesterday. This is opposite from where I am now seated. This was the number of people that got together voting for a political party and the party of the former president, Rafael Correa. And to close, let me remind you that we have another risk. These are the risks that will come hand in hand with the fact of regulations, controlling information, the lack of information, and the political campaign. We haven't spoken about that today, but I have had the opportunity of discussing this with some of you as members of this community. And I want to mention this because we should avoid an excess of control. We have to avoid abuse in this sense. Evidently, the campaign will be taking place through some kind of device. So with that, I would like to close. Thank you very much on behalf of the Institute for Democracy. And I am happy to take any questions. Thank you, Maria Jose. We now give the floor to Maryleana Mendez. She will be speaking from a different standpoint, protection of human rights in the context of the pandemic and the interaction with technology and the practice of rights, but more from the standpoint of how technology can contribute to the economic recovery and the importance of generating a whole array of activities related to the pandemic. And this has to do with some of the things that Maria Jose was referring to, for example, how to practice politics and other areas of our social lives. So Mariana will be telling us about that and what is being contributed from the private sector. Welcome, Maryleana. Thank you, Maria Paz. Thank you for the invitation. I will now share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes, thank you. Well, I would like to thank LAC IGF for this invitation. It is a pleasure for us to be here and to speak about internet and the pandemic opportunities and impact on human rights of the deployed technologies. I would like to start referring to the impact of the pandemic on the economy. It has been a very strong impact. We understand that we are at the level of a post-war situation. The International Monetary Fund estimates that the GDP drop will be about 9% for Latin American region in 2020, the increase in unemployment of 10%. This means that there will be an increase in poverty with 90 million people who are in a situation of extreme poverty in the region. So this is one of the very complex side effects of this pandemic. And of course, this is of enormous concern for every state and organization that participate in the Latin American markets. We conducted a very interesting study that speaks about this impact and how to recover. This is called the status of digitalization in Latin America vis-a-vis COVID-19. This is a publication of the CAF done by Dr. Raul Katz and other famous economists. So we see that if a relationship is established with a digitalization level, and the negative impact of the pandemic on the GDP, we can conclude that the greater the digitalization, the lower the negative economic impact in the medium and long term. This is something that we were aware of even before, but here we have empirical data that confirms this. So the higher the level of digitalization, the lower the impact and the speedier the recovery. We have to bear in mind that the telecommunications networks are the basis for digitalization. This has been demonstrated all along this pandemic. These are topics that were already highlighted by Edison. These are topics that for those of us who've been working with for some time have always commented and reflected on this. Now, this had not necessarily become a realization of the public authorities until now. This represents an enormous opportunity, particularly to face topics related to the digital divide. So as I was saying, telecommunications are a strategic ally to tackle with the social economic effects of the health crisis. The networks have been able to respond to the demands in traffic. There was an apocalyptic announcement stating that the networks would be crashing and that we would be isolated and so on.
But that, fortunately, although people were convinced about that, the networks have been able to meet the demands with despite the very significant increases, as you can see in the charts to your right. So there was an increase of traffic, and that increase was sustained at higher levels. Now there are no new peaks of demand, but there's been a sustained increase. An increase by it was increased by 30 or 40%, and especially with demand peaks in the traffic, especially uploading. That is a component that is important for contents production and for remote meetings, etc. It's also important to point out that the pandemic has shown what are the elements that are important for the governments and for the progress of society. We have many examples. The issue of banking or financial digital inclusion. In some countries, they had to close the stores where people could recharge their mobiles, and so people would no longer have access to their bank accounts. In other cases, although there are digital signatures and people can sign digitally in the countries, these digital signatures were not necessarily valid to for legal purposes. So as a consequence, people had to go to government offices to sign physically. And we also see education. A lot has been said about the difference and the digital divide in education, and we are fully aware of the importance of that topic. But there were elements within the educational processes that were not ready for digitalization, and also capacity building among teachers. That is, there have been several elements that are not just that don't have to do so much with the digital authorities, but other authorities. And the pandemic has made that evident. And in many cases, fortunately, the solution was accelerated, and in other cases, people are working at finding solutions. Definitely, all this experience that I just heard and many more experiences should be lessons learned that should lead to positive changes in the system. I'd like to point out that regulations became more flexible. For instance, submission of reports. They also flexibilized some issues related to payments, direct payments to authorities, etc. And they were possible. They didn't affect the service. They made it possible. They brought relief to the finances, both of the operators and users. So this too shows that we are capable of having a dialogue indeed, and that we can get close to each other, the industry and the local authorities and the civil society, to look for common solutions that may be of use to all the parts participating in the digital connectivity process. Another important thing to point out is that we need to maintain a balance, and the industry needs to be sustainable. And sustaining connectivity is of key importance. In Colombia, there's a campaign defining that. And why do I say that? Because many of the actions of facilitating connectivity and not uh, cutting services, they were not really uh, uh, they were not targeting specific populations. It was general. So there, of course, you need the cash flow necessary to make this possible. In addition, there was a change in traffic because there were networks that were reinforced from the side of industries and companies, and the demand was directed to the residential areas, and that needed adjustments. So here there's a lesson learned. That is the possibility of that the possibilities exist, and that we must focus on solutions, and universalization of the services is an ethic imperative, and that we should all fight for that to be achieved. And all the people involved in these processes should be active. All users should clearly understand that if they have the possibility of paying for services, there are other people that need that payment to maintain their connectivity. So we are speaking of solidarity, which needs to be included in the equation. Of course, as we said, the people that are not connected are the ones that are suffering the most in this crisis. This is something that we've said for a long time. But today, with the pandemic, that becomes even more noticeable in its crudest way. Hence, the need for digital inclusion of people and companies, because the companies too have suffered. We need to create policies to develop digital skills, especially among vulnerable generations, vulnerable to this health emergency. Not only do we have a geographic connectivity gap, but or an income gap of digital skills, and also a gender gap, uh, and also an age gap. So the pandemic has been revealing in that respect, showing those gaps. And in the regulators global symposium, they said precisely that the rules of the game have changed, and that we need to consider that this experience. when this pandemic is over, we are not going to act in the same way as we did in the past. So what do we consider that should be essential elements in this process of recovery? First of all, the legal security. That is, the telecom operators are doing and will continue to make important investment in the technological infrastructure with very short cycles of obsolescence. So what we need is a playing field where with rules of the game that must be very clear. It's you can't take advantage of the pandemic to make short-term changes that may go against the interest of users. In addition, the ICTs, we know that ICTs are enablers in many sectors of society. Now, in order for us to be able to leverage that, we need communicating vessels among all the sectors to promote the development of the region. This is no longer a matter of the regulatory authorities of the ICTs. This goes far beyond. The digitalization needs to be discussed with the ministries of finance, education, security. These are absolutely necessary elements so that the processes may digitalize the services and hence the populations, the people can make a more effective use of them and to make the most of the benefits of digital society. And the other thing is the productive use. These are closely related. In order for the connectivity to have a productive use and for it to make a difference in the life of people, we need to see it holistically. We need to see the entire ecosystem, and that includes a lot of different sectors involved. The digitalization, definitely, as we've seen, it's been proven that is key for recovery. There's evidence of that. That is the possibility for this to have a recovery as with a V shape will depend a lot on the digital skills that the countries develop. But regardless of that, what are the digital skills that we are going to develop going forward? And how can we have that big digital agenda that may enable more and more people enjoying the benefits of the information society? Now, they have implemented regulatory actions with no technical basis and discretionally, and this hinders the progress, the advance of telecommunications. The private sector has business models that are well established to provide services, and as I said, connectivity has improved, and so has the speed improved. We are in an affordable internet index that is good across Latin America, but this depends on a stable regulatory framework. And we can't adopt any regulatory actions during the pandemic, but that we should continue after the pandemic is over. We need to see the final balance, and we need to promote connectivity, and we see it also in other countries in the regions, where the regulators are trying to make this to promote the further progress of this. Thank you, Maryleana. Well, yes, let me finish. I think that these are the right spaces, we must start a process of joint thought to put an end to the digital divide. The public and private partnership should be in the midst of this. We should launch a new generation of partnerships to get the new normality. And we have to think of how we're going to integrate the different players. And of course, digitalization will strengthen the resilience, not just of the cities, the people, the work, to face issues such as those that unfortunately we had to experience in recent months. So we thank you all for your attention, and we are at your disposal if you want to ask questions. Thank you, Maryleana. And I want to thank all the panelists in this segment. I think that we have 2 questions by the audience. So I now give the floor to Elia Hernandez, who is our Q&A secretary. Leah? Thank you, Maria Paz. We have a question by Reynaldo Alonso. I think that this is for any panelist. How does the community see the use of social media to increase the access, scope, and transparency? I don't know who would like to answer this.
I think that this is a good question, namely the use of the social media during the pandemic has been strongly debated. On one hand, these served as an instrument to provide information, but on the other hand, platforms and social media and the governments have made a more intensive use of these options, taken what we could call or describe as best practices. And I thank you for the question. Through the interest of the civil society, organizations, and the different platforms, we're going to have a panel of experts on September 15th and 16th in order to discuss these best practices that we learned, the challenges of using the social media during the pandemic, and to a certain extent, to see which were the lessons learned, which of the new measures adopted as a result of the pandemic were positive, and which are some of the challenges we envisage. Because these platforms also increased the management of contents. So, all right. So we're going to produce a guideline with key recommendations in this sense. So that was a good question. And I think this is one of the key points that we can take home from this pandemic. Thank you, Edison. We have another question. This question is asked by Valeria Vitancourt, addressed at Maryleana Mendez, and she refers to the focus of the investments of the private sector, particularly the major telecommunications operators, to understand the ethical imperative of universalizing services. Which aspects and services would the investments of the private sector be addressed in the coming years? Which would be the priorities? As I mentioned in my presentation, the investments in the area of telecommunications, these cycles are very brief. The same technology becomes old. So when we speak about ethical imperatives, this is something we have been working on for many, many years at this association and also in many places where we discuss this topic. Now, it is necessary that the private sector investments should continue expanding in terms of fixed and mobile connectivity. Of course, this requires additional efforts in order to extend the fiber optic network, because a fiber and optic network should go beyond the densely populated areas over to medium density populated areas, providing higher speed services which are more resilient in terms of the services provided. There is an additional issue which was quite clear, and this is because it is the states that have to guarantee connectivity. This resulted from universal service funds. In many countries, this consists of a lot of money, but for different reasons, for economic reasons, or for reasons related to a strong bureaucracy around the possibility of investing. Well, I think that there we have a key element for closing this digital divide. We have to have cross-cutting projects supported from the highest government levels that will allow investing these universal funds. And these should be supplemented by private investment in these areas which are not so profitable. So we have to develop the necessary networks in order to connect the largest amount of people possible. As we said, the digital divide has evolved. We not only focus on the geographical aspect of the digital divide, namely when there is a limited demand and so on, well, we have to count on the investment of the state. But then there are other types of divides that have been generated, and these divides are the direct responsibility of the states. The universal service programs should also include programs to close these divides as a result of vulnerability in terms of income. For example, basic baskets so that all people can have access to these. And this leads us to other types of divides. What do I aim at with my comments? So operators should invest in all those technologies and services that have a market and are beneficial. But insofar as a state, I lower the cost so the network can be expanded, and so that the business model can then be expanded accordingly, we will reach a moment in which, for some reasons of vulnerability in terms of income, that is a situation in which we should invest the universal service funds. But there have to be other issues related to developing digital skills, to encourage people to become more resilient when facing situations of emergency as the one we are experiencing now. Thank you, Maryleana. Thank you, Leah. I think your last comment responded many of the questions that were asked. So I would like to now wrap up this session. We have gone beyond the time. We'd like to thank all the participants. We'd like to thank all the panelists. All the presentations were very, very interesting. We have seen this topic from several angles. For example, the use of technology in the context of the pandemic, and how the intensive use of data provides some new options, but also this involves certain risks, for example, privacy. In the second block, we started looking at the impacts and challenges of technology in the context of the pandemic. So very often over these past months, we have realized how the pandemic has also had a relevant impact on the impact of other types of rights, social, economic, and cultural rights. It has also affected right of expression, etc. So there are many lessons learned, which we hope will strengthen us in the sense of providing the technology at the service of all human beings. Thank you very much, and we look forward to meeting you tomorrow at the next session of LAC IGF 13. Thank you very much, Maria Paz. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the participants of this panel. I'd like to thank all the attendees in this first day of LAC IGF 13. We invite you to participate tomorrow. We will be looking at issue of intensity of technology in the context of COVID-19, technology and public policy, the challenges of information and transparency in the context of the pandemic, transformation, acceleration, and the use of new technologies in a post-COVID-19 world. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.